listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I remain your host, Jason Johnston Yellen, and staring back at me from FaceTime within my iPhone is Joshua Morrissey Hatton. Hello, Joshua.
How are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. I'm excited because, as regular listeners know, in Extra Extra, you or I bring a recent whiskey-related news story to the attention of the other. We read it in the first half, we riff on it in the second half, and we always get out of here in a tight 35.
Always.
And one of my favourite times is when you're the man in charge of bringing the story to my attention.
All right.
So I'm excited to see what you brought. However, before we get into today's article, we did want to do a little bit of housekeeping from the last episode, where we were very excited in covering the new comments period for the designation of American single malt whiskey as a defined category.
Oh my gosh, every single whiskey dork listening to this right now, you just mentioned TTB and proposed comment periods and American single malt, and they're like, fuck, give it to me.
There's a lot to get excited about.
I'm surprised you're telling me we made a mistake, or maybe two mistakes. What sort of housekeeping, cleaning are we doing here, Jason?
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to attach the word mistakes to housekeeping. I'm just revisiting some of the spaces we left open.
There you go.
So, in our last episode, we made reference to Amanda Beckwith, who's with Virginia Distilling or Distillery Company, Joshua?
It's Distillery Company.
Because normally I would look at the sample bottles on my desk at this point so that I would get it absolutely spot on.
Oh, yeah. You're traveling. That's why you sound different than usual.
I do.
Yeah,
I sound like I'm calling in from outer space because I'm calling in from outer space.
Not from Uranus?
The low-hanging fruit is the sweetest. I'm not hanging out of, So we are going with Virginia Distillery Company.
Are those dingleberries the low-hanging fruit?
I'm glad you chuckled at your own juvenile.
Someone's got to laugh at my jokes. Anyway, please continue. Yes, Virginia Distillery Company, Amanda Beckwith.
So Amanda wrote in, you and I have been making mention in the last episode about blending materials and what role blending materials might have. And so... Yes.
Can you, before you go too deep into here, can we just really, really quickly remind our listeners of the proposed guidelines to American single malt? I'll throw some of them out there really quickly, right? Like it's 100% malted barley. It's distilled at a single distillery. It can be matured in casks other than new charred oak. That's a new thing. Right, and matured in casks no larger than 700 liters, right? So that meets what the rest of the world is doing. There is no stipulation on minimum age statement put forth.
That is correct.
And then the other thing, and this is the part that you're getting to, right? While it can't be flavored, there's this little bit about, caramel coloring being okay, but then there's sort of these like blending components that are potentially permissible, and that's something that's what you're referring to in this comment here, right?
Yeah, and one aspect, if we're talking about housekeeping here, everything that was covered in the last episode is up for discussion. It's not necessarily part of the final designation. And so there are comments being solicited for a range of aspects of what would then become the designation. So Amanda, as we'd mentioned here, VDC, said, "Good morning," which is very decent. That's a lovely way to open a text, especially because I was on the West Coast and it came in at 5 a.m. local time.
That is the morning.
She says, "I've recently done a bit of research on quote-unquote blending materials, as that was not one of the components the ASMWC had advocated for. And Joshua, I know you always like filling in the acronyms for people. So ASMWC?
American Single Malt Whiskey Cataclysm?
Commission. So it wasn't part of the original, right? Apparently, this is Amanda, it's par for the course for the TTB and covers any distilled spirit before extra designations can kick in to preclude blending materials. And she says that is, straight, right? So straight whiskies that we're familiar with within the American realm.
Right, and that's the other thing that I wanted to add, too. There was nothing in these designations that said we can or cannot use straight, the term straight, or the term bottled and bond, which are very common to American whiskeys. There's no talk about it, but it sounds like there's nothing against it either. Yeah,
right.
Okay, yep, all right, continue.
And so she says, I know you were discussing this on your last episode, so I thought I'd share the geekiness. I've never used blending materials for whiskey, but it reminded me of a training I once had on boisé for cognac.
Which we've talked about previously in the podcast with our friends at Catoctin Creek, who you're wearing their shirt, by the way.
It's a day of the week that ends in Y, so I'm in a Catoctin Creek t-shirt. And then Amanda sent over Chapter 7 from the ttb.gov regulations. And this is the type of thing that our very own Jess Lomas loves reading through, and is definitely a type of thing, if you are having any difficulty getting off to sleep at night, this is something you should really call up on your iPad. Yeah, for example, FD&C Yellow No. 5 is added to straight bourbon whiskey. The resulting product is no longer straight bourbon whiskey. The product is now a distilled spirits specialty and must be labeled with a statement of composition, such as straight bourbon whiskey with FD&C Yellow No. 5 added.
Wow. Okay. So, all right. So the comment there is you can put in blending materials, but if we're to take a cue from Chapter 7 here, it's saying you can use them. You just have to list it out. You have to mention it. Okay. All right.
Exactly. And I think one of the things you and I were talking about in the last episode, maybe we're talking about it with the record button hit, maybe we were talking about it without the record button hit, but the idea being for something like chill filtration and additional colouring in Scotland, it's sometimes the case if you don't chill filter and you don't add colour, you put on your label that you don't chill filter and you don't add colour, but nobody is going the other way. Nobody is saying, hey, we chill filter and that's on our label. We add colour and that's on our label.
Unless you're in Germany, where the laws state you have to list if they're... It doesn't necessarily stipulate you have to list chill filtration, but if you're adding coloring of any sort, that does have to be listed on the label.
Right.
There you go.
So it's interesting seeing those parallel moments and then those separate moments. And I like in this commenting period, if colouring does end up being allowed, now, without overcomplicating the issue here, it's not like American single malt whiskey is going to have a straight designation.
Right.
So could you add the colour and not have to put it on the label?
That is a really excellent question. It makes me think of, in a slightly tenuous way, it makes me think of the time we sent a label to the TTB and we listed that the whiskey was non-chill filtered, all-natural color. The all-natural color meaning that there was no color added. The color that you see of the whiskey is completely natural. The TTB took that as us saying we have added a natural colorant to the whiskey. So, right, so it does bring up some questions on how they would need to classify it, if at all, that coloring is added.
Well, and the fact that in this comments period you can see what is and is not important to consumers, to others within the industry, and it'll be interesting to see what type of response comes from the comments being made.
Yeah.
So there you go. So I was glad to get that text from Amanda. We have had some conversations with some other folk in the industry and associated with the commission, but we're not ready for a full statement from them just yet.
Right. So, well, firstly, thank you for bringing that up. It was good to add a little color to last week's episode, or not last week's, but the last extra, which was really a popular download for us. So, are we ready to move on? Because I've got this article that I thought was really cool. So this is from the Robb Report, and it came out August 10, written by one Jonah Flicker, and the headline states, "A Long-Shuttered whiskey distillery is returning with an uncommon floral Scotch."
Okay. Floral, you have my attention with floral here.
Oh, same. The subheader, "The reborn Rosebank will make a lowland style of whiskey, starting with a 31-year-old distilled before it closed in the 1990s." So that's interesting.
It'd be hard to distill it after they closed, to be honest.
With that attitude. But it is kind of interesting that they're releasing a 31-year-old as a, hey, we're back.
Am I remembering correctly that they had a 30-year-old release last year?
I think so. Yes, you are remembering correctly. I remember there was a 25-year-old too, but that was probably from 5 years prior to that. So there you go.
Maybe before it changed ownership. But anyway, this is too much riffing, Joshua. Let's get on with the reading. Let's stay focused.
You're going to like the way this kicks off. Scotland is haunted. But it's not just ancient castles with gossamer wraiths flitting around the dungeons and hallways. There are many ghost distilleries as well. But recently, some of these abandoned whiskey-making sites are being reanimated after decades of moldering. I really like the style that Jonah has here. I want to take out my D20 and start killing orcs. Anyway, one of the latest is Rosebank, a distillery in the lowland region of Scotland that is lesser known but has some excellent whiskey to offer, including this new rare 31-year-old single malt. The lowland region is known for producing a lighter, more floral style of whiskey, according to many experts. The number of distilleries in the area might be dwarfed by its neighbor Speyside to the north, but the unique character of the liquid is definitely worth checking out. A notable difference is that many producers in the lowland region triple distill their whiskey. We'll talk about that in a minute. A style typically...
Trying hard not to riff.
A style typically more associated with Irish whiskey than Scotch. Points, by the way, to Jonah here for using whiskey without the E for Scotch and whiskey with the E for Irish. He knows what he's doing here. Some names you may have heard of include Auchentoshan, Bladnoch, and Girvan, which produces grain whiskey for William Grant and Sons, as well as Hendrick's Gin. Rosebank was a distillery in Falkirk, Scotland, that closed in 1993. That's when Elijah was born, wasn't it? 93? Is there a connection?
Coincidence?
It's funny, you never see Elijah and Rosebank in the same room. So it closed in 93, more than 150 years after it opened. There are various reasons for the closure, but essentially it was not considered financially viable to keep it running at the time. Over the years, parts of the property were converted into other businesses, and in 2008, large pieces of the metal were stolen from the stills, rendering them completely inoperable. But in 2017, independent company Ian MacLeod Distillers, who also owned Glengoyne and Tamdhu, by the way, acquired the site and remaining stocks, and whiskey will once again flow from the distillery sometime next year, albeit via new stills. In the meantime, you can toast to Rosebank's new life with this 31-year-old single malt, a liquid that was taken from casks that were filled before it was mothballed. The whiskey is unpeated and bottled at 48.1% ABV. Tasting notes include, I'm going to like this, lime, lemongrass, and coriander on the nose, followed by mint, berry, and banana bread on the palate. Indeed, this is unlike extra-aged whiskey you've tried from other regions. And according to distillery manager Malcolm Rennie, who we've mentioned many times in this podcast, it's the first under his tenure and the last old Rosebank release before it opens again to the public. Rosebank 31-year-old will be available from the Rosebank website starting August 11, which by the time this is released will be past that date. And you can find it...
Bottles still available?
And you can find it at retailers in the UK. It'll be some time before we get to try new whiskey from the new distillery, but this taste from the past might offer some clues of what's to come. And there's your article, Jason.
All right, let's take a quick break and come back for some well-deserved riffing. Interestingly there, Joshua, as I was listening to that, it sounded a bit more like a press release. What was it about this Robb Report piece that you wanted to bring to our attention?
Well, I want to say again that I liked this article, and I really enjoyed Jonah's coverage and his style. He really set a tone that I thought was cool. However, there's something that he mentioned in here that's not necessarily accurate. And there's so many misconceptions within the whiskey world that I want to make sure that it's clear, you know. So he had said that that lowlands are known for triple distilling. In fact, his words here are, a notable difference is that many producers in the lowland region triple distill their whiskey, a style more associated with Irish whiskey than Scotch. And to my knowledge, there was Rosebank, and we're going to talk about their distillation and condensation in a bit because that is quite unusual. And then there's Auchentoshan. But, you know, you've got distilleries like Glenkinchie, which is not triple distilled. You've got Annandale, you've got Lochlee coming out, you've got Holyrood, the Glasgow Distillery, right? Maybe historically speaking, there were distilleries that were triple distilling and have been shuttered for many years, and maybe in that case he is correct. I can't say off the top of my head I have an intimate understanding of all the lowland distilleries that once lived and are now gone. But as far as modern distillation goes, and by modern, I'm talking maybe from the 80s till now, the majority of them have been double distilled just like everyone else. And I would also go so far as to say that, you know, this idea of a lowland style whiskey is really an anachronism. It's you know, and I'd love to hear your thoughts because you've been to Holyrood, right? And we've spoken with our friends at the Lochlee Distillery, and I'd argue that, and we've been to Annandale, right? And I'd argue that lowland distilleries don't really look like what we think of as lowland distilleries.
Yeah, I think for our One Nation Under Whiskey, where we spoke with John Campbell and David Ferguson, and I'd seen David previously mention on an Impex deep dive that they weren't coming out to make a regional style.
Yeah.
They were coming out to make Lochley Whisky, and Lochley Whisky would take the form of Lochley Whisky.
Yeah.
And I thought it was quite an interesting comment when, for us as whisky consumers, we've had a lot of reasons to avoid the lowlands for 3 decades, right? And we've seen the lowland region shrinking. And now in the last few years, we've really seen the lowland region exploding. And in talking to Nick Ravenhall over at Holyrood, and as you rightly say, the team over there as well, they're just looking to make exciting whiskies. Interesting grains, interesting yeasts, ways of bringing flavors together, all distilled at the Holyrood Distillery. And so yeah, I think you are spot on, where it's a bit of an anachronism to talk about this more delicate floral style, which is why, in listening to you reading this article, I'm quite excited to hear Rosebank claiming that, right? At the time, you've got the new distilleries saying, hey, look, we might be geographically located here, but we're just here to make whiskey. And then you've got Rosebank with a century and a half of production in Falkirk, just outside Edinburgh, saying, look, we know what we did back in the day, and we know that we will do that again.
Yeah, I'm also excited because while, like you had said, yes, the idea of lowland distilleries having a particular style is an anachronism, Rosebank is saying, hey, we're back, and what you've remembered us for is what we're going to do again. That is super cool, and I want to touch on that again. I just want to bring us quickly back to the idea of triple distilling, and triple distilling potentially, or our understanding of it, equating to a lighter spirit. And all we have to do is think of Hazelburn, which is a triple distilled whiskey out of Campbelltown, and that is very heavy. Mortlach, which is 2.78 times distilled, something like that, and that is a heavy spirit. So this idea that triple distillation equals lighter spirit, I think is very much, another misconception. Just because something is triple distilled doesn't mean you're making this lighter flavored spirit. There's so many other things that come into play, starting all the way from the mashing, through to maturation, that can change the style. So the fact that Rosebank is coming to us saying we're going to have a lighter, more floral style of whiskey, I think is a nice call to the idea of Jason. What's going on in your in the background there?
I decided while you were talking that I would just start up a leaf blower and start blowing it out the window. So if you're picking up any leaf blower engine noise, that's me. Yeah. That's 100% me just cleaning the driveway. Don't you worry about it. You just keep talking.
Does it go from blow to suck? Funny, it doesn't look Jewish. Anyway, so I really like this idea that Rosebank is saying they're going to come to the market with a lighter, more floral style of spirit. But again, back to the comparison to Hazelburn coming out of Springbank as a triple distilled spirit. Rosebank similarly will be a triple distilled spirit, and both distilleries condense that spirit through worm tubs, which give you this sort of heavier style of liquid. So I wonder if we could talk about that for a little bit, because that's, you can see why people can be a bit confused as to where style comes from.
Well, and I think with someone like Rosebank, you're talking a light spirit with a heavy texture. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, actually. You and I talked about this just a few months ago, where on our flavometer we have floral. We have room for floral, and we almost never use it. Mm-hmm. And then in the rare occasions that we do get to use that qualifier, we're only putting a few notches on it. And there's I don't know if we're not seeing a lot of floral whiskies on offer, or whether we've been damaged by FWP, and so floral only counts when it's blowing your brains out. And so to think of floral being active, to have it be a design aspect of a single malt, I think it'll be good. It'll be good to see how it plays out. And even when you were reading some of those tasting notes there, like I know they were talking berries, and I think I might have heard you say cardamom in there as well. Were there designated floral notes happening there?
No, not in the tasting notes that he gave. Well, let me read it once more.
Like you and I say things like summer meadow, or fresh meadow in the morning, or fresh dew on a summer meadow. And this is running with things like lime, lemongrass, coriander, all delicious, mint, berry, banana bread on the palate. So, sure, mint grows, but I would think more of an herbaceousness from the mint.
Yeah, like all of those notes that they said told me herbaceous rather than floral. And so I'm going to do something a bit different. So I wrote a review on 2 Rosebanks back on June 13th, 2011. And I'm going to read them to you. Actually, it's one Rosebank. It's one Rosebank. And this was a 19-year-old from an ex-bourbon cask. And
what's the distillation year?
So it was 19 years old in 2011.
Okay. 11s and 19s, those are tough to work out. What are we looking at?
1992, sure. So on the nose, so here we go. And it was 60.8% alcohol. Right?
Oh, yes, please.
And it says, on the nose, a lightly fruited nose, think pear and pineapple, with hints of herbal teas. Right, so herbal teas, we're in that area, right?
Yeah.
White pepper and even some notes of sweet hay. Milk chocolate and a touch of light caramel. Nice notes I often find in Rosebank. So apparently in 2011 I had a few Rosebanks. I just didn't happen to. This is the only Rosebank I reviewed on my website way back when. So anyway, back to the fruits now, same as before. What amazes me is how easily at 60.8% ABV this could be nosed. You'd think this is a low ABV whiskey. Ready for this? Ready for this? Yeah, texture, right? Nasal texture. Rose petals and sugared and honeyed chamomile. That closes out my nose notes, all right? On the mouth, bright, effervescent, and loaded with lemon fizz candies, over-sugared applesauce, lemon, and lemons. Did I mention lemons? How about lemons? Oh, wait, lemons. More white pepper, and now some white bread toast. And then the finish, juicy fruit gum, like Dead On, more white pepper and sugar cane, lasting peppery finish. And then I always summed it up, say, in sum, a very one-sided whiskey, but one that is so easily consumed, perhaps as an aperitif or a midday pick-me-up or a late summer relaxer.
So it sounds kind of bright and penetrating with lemon, but then not a lot of development around that. Especially when you say aperitif.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, granted, this is a single cask, right, from an independent bottler, not necessarily highlighting what the distillery wants to show. And, I can often I always took, and you taught me this before I read the book, but I always took Michael Jackson's suggestions of there's always nice things to be said. But sometimes I can read between my lines and know where I'm kind of like, sticking an elbow. And I don't think I stuck any elbows anywhere, It was just sort of a nice, pleasant, light whiskey.
But also, as you're talking there about the increased strength on that, also makes me think of another distillery that uses worm tubs in Craigellachie, where we've experienced some higher ABVs and found them very palatable. Both on the, I say palatable, maybe I mean accessible, both on the nose and on the palate, because you have that texture coming through. You have those oils present.
Yeah. Again, I know you bring up the example of Craigellachie, and I think that's a good one. But it makes me think back to the Hazelburn idea, back to the triple distillation in worm tubs. But I am keeping Craigellachie in the back of my mind here. Again, there's so many variables that equate to what does this whiskey taste like. And it could be how it's fermented. If you think Springbank, their wash is typically 4.5%, 5.5% ABV, whereas many other distilleries are 8, 9, 10% ABV. So you have a variance there. And then we also don't know where they're taking their cuts, right? A higher heart's cut could equate to a lighter spirit, just like we talk about, the differences between Kilchoman and Ardbeg, who are basically using the same peated barley that they get from Port Ellen maltings, but Kilchoman comes across as light, fruity, citrusy, and Ardbeg comes across as heavier and ashy, and we're just dealing with subtle differences in fermentation and distillation. So, I think, in my opinion, I'm excited by this. Any distillery reopening, I think, is fantastic, especially one that is as legendary as Rosebank. But I am curious to dig a little deeper to find out the whys and what fors that make this that, quote-unquote, lighter, more floral style or quote-unquote lowland style of whiskey,
Well, and just to kind of bring our floral conversation full circle, floral doesn't necessarily mean flowers.
Yes.
To me, in listening to floral in other places, it can mean lime, right? It could be that brightness of citrus could have a certain florality to it. And so it's a bit like when we reconsidered our use of rich on the flavometer. I think Balancer had written in asking about that. And I think floral can mean quite effusive in the glass. And I know you talked about the effervescence on the palate of the Rosebank that you were tasting there.
Yep.
But I also wonder about that kind of effervescence on the nose, a brightness.
So you're equating floral to simply mean lighter and brighter, where I'm taking it a bit more on face value. And I think I would venture a guess that more people would do what I'm doing rather than what you're doing. And I don't know that either one is correct or incorrect, but I do think it's interesting. So why are you equating floral to citrus and to that effusive quality?
Because just in your review there where you talked about the honeyed chamomile, right? And I think, yes, that's a very floral note.
Sure. Yeah.
Chamomile and bags of chamomile are very floral. But then I'm thinking about Jonah's article there with the tasting notes that I assume come from the distillery. There wasn't one note from the distillery that you would say, oh, that's floral. But you would say that's bright and effusive. Lemongrass. Would you say lemongrass was floral?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? It's like it's herbaceous and citrusy and
right. Then it goes in with the mint that then came on the palate. So, it's not striking me that floral needs to be a straight up florality.
But I do wonder who's wording that is. Is that Jonah's wording? Is that Rosebank's wording? Right, like the Balvenie talks about them being the honeyed malt. Does Rosebank want to talk about themselves as being the light and floral malt? And if that's the case, then I would love to hear from them. What is their key note?
If you go to their website, they talk floral all across their website.
There you go.
So yes, it's very much their word.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting. I read really quickly because I know we're getting close to our 35-minute marker here.
Real close to our tight 35.
35, that's it. I read another article, I think it was the Whisky Wash, where they showed the actual stills being installed, and that was in March of 2022. And then I met up with Gordon Dundas, who's with Ian McLeod Distillers, and he was talking about Rosebank. And if memory serves, I think he said Spirit started running. Have they perfected it? I don't know. I think it's worth reaching out to Gordon again, maybe get an official update on Rosebank.
Yeah, I think I would like that for One Nation Under Whiskey. I would hazard a guess our listeners would like that for One Nation Under Whiskey. So
there you go.
Let's see if we can make that happen.
All right, I'll work on it.
All right, let's get out of here on that then. If you'd like to drop us an email, questions@onenationunderwhiskey.com, or simply use the info account, info@singlecastnation.com. We already know what we're covering in the next Extra, but you'll have to tune in to see what that is. Until then, peace.
Peace.
All right, should we jump in?
I'm ready. Ready to rock.
Hello. Ready? Doing it?
Yeah.
Ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, dear
Just
listeners,
start it whenever you want to start it.
To the latest episode of Extra. This is all about Joshua talking over Jason.